Hello and welcome to the Sibylline Forecast. I'm Gareth Westwood, Head of Global Intelligence, and you join us from central London on a very wet and windy Tuesday afternoon on the 10th of January 2023. Welcome to episode 1. In this week's episode, we'll be joined by Anastasia Chisholm to discuss Israel's newly appointed government. Sydney Stewart will help us unpack the recent attacks on US energy infrastructure, and Zsofia Wolford will help us understand recent tensions in Kosovo. Well, today to discuss Israel, we are joined by Anastasia Chisholm. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks. I'm well. How are you?
Very good. Now, I know we've been watching this situation for quite some time. Your desk in particular has been putting out quite a lot of reporting to clients over the Christmas period. But for those listeners and indeed viewers who aren't quite up to speed yet on the new government and where we are, can you give us a bit of context?
Yeah, of course. So Israel held its fifth elections in 4 years on the 1st of November, and these resulted in a 64-seat majority to a right religious government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who was sworn in on the 29th for his sixth term as Prime Minister of Israel. Now, following the elections on the 1st of November, in the weeks after, Benjamin Netanyahu engaged in a kind of prolonged negotiation process with coalition partners, namely ultra-Orthodox and conservative partners, primarily on the issues of ministerial appointments as well as policy. Coming out of this, we've seen some ministerial appointments that have been deemed controversial, particularly by some elements of the left wing in Israel, and this has in part been due to the need to fast-track some legislation to essentially facilitate these appointments. Nonetheless, Israel's government was sworn in on the 29th of December.
Thanks, Anastasia. So we've seen quite a few appointments as recently as last week, and I've been reading a lot of criticism in the media. I know we've been pushing out alerts at our end. What are we seeing at the minute in terms of reaction? Are we seeing more stability, or are we seeing security risks that could affect organisations and individuals?
We're definitely seeing some security risk emerge from this. Last weekend, so the 7th of January, we observed some pretty major protests in central Tel Aviv, right by Habima Square, of about 20,000 anti-government demonstrators. Now, the government's made some moves as recently as yesterday to kind of clamp down on protesters, particularly those blocking roads such as the Ayalon Highway, which we did see on Saturday the 7th. In the coming weeks, we can expect to see a continuation of these kind of large-scale rallies. And although they've been relatively peaceful so far, the potential presence or rallying of pro-Netanyahu and pro-government protesters will increase the likelihood of clashes and potentially bystander risks for personnel travelling in central Tel Aviv, which will remain a hotspot, as well as areas of Jerusalem.
So you said, this is Netanyahu's sixth crack at the whip. How is this different? And what does this mean, going forward in the medium term and regionally as well?
No, definitely. In the past week or so, we've seen some developments that may hint at what is to come regionally, as well as a consequence of the new government. Last week, the National Security Minister, the newly appointed minister, paid a visit to Temple Mount, also known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. This spurred concerns among regional governments of a potential change in the status quo of the site, which represents essentially a red line for Palestinian militant groups. And these kind of elevated concerns triggered a UN Security Council meeting last week, so on the 5th of January. While there isn't any indication right now that the government will look to change the status quo of the site, key flashpoints in the coming months, especially during Ramadan, when the issue of the rights of Muslim worshippers at the site is particularly contentious, trigger events are likely to be any instance of Israeli settlers storming the compound, as well as Israeli police using heavy-handed tactics against Muslim worshippers, or potentially restricting access to Muslim worshippers in any way. Now, implications that we can see stemming from this will be the increased risk of clashes at the compound itself, as well as wider unrest in the Palestinian territories, so in areas of Gaza and the West Bank. And knock-on effects of these elevated ethno-religious tensions will threaten a return to potentially a spate of terror attacks, as we witnessed last spring even, and the less likely event of a major escalation, a cross-border escalation between Gaza and Israel. Although at present we haven't seen indications that such an escalation is imminent. So on the Iran issue, Benjamin Netanyahu is highly likely to try and lead a more cohesive anti-Iran policy with the US. And this comes against the backdrop of JCPOA renewal negotiations, which have effectively collapsed in recent months, though the Biden administration is still reportedly conducting covert diplomacy with Iran and maybe trying to strike a more limited nuclear deal. That being said, increased hostile rhetoric between Iran and Israel will in turn drive regional tensions, and we're likely to see an uptick in tit-for-tat hostilities.
And so are we going to see a conflict in the next 12, 24 months, or will it remain largely, as you say, tit-for-tat and asymmetrical?
At present, an armed conflict remains unlikely. So as you said, it's likely to remain asymmetric. Likely targets of such hostilities would be critical infrastructure, cyber infrastructure in particular. So we can definitely expect to see more of that in the coming months.
Well, thank you again for joining us, and I'm sure it's an issue that your desk will be very busy with over the coming weeks and months. Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Now to the US, and recent attacks on energy infrastructure have left many scratching their heads and wondering what on earth is going on. To help us unpick this, we have Sydney Stewart, our North American analyst. Delighted that you can join us, Sydney. And I think, like me, many of our viewers and listeners will be wondering what on earth has been going on in this space. Maybe you can add a little bit of context for us.
Well, it's a great question. What is going on? It's rather been a couple... there have been a couple peculiar incidents in the US recently with regards to our electricity infrastructure. So back on the 3rd of December, we had an initial attack against two electricity substations in Moore County, North Carolina. Now, this left ultimately 40,000 people without power during a period when temperatures were sub-zero, actually. So many people were very cold, or sub-zero Celsius, that is. Many people were very cold and without power for up to 4 days as the electricity utility worked to repair what had occurred. So there was a coordinated attempt by several individuals to take out 2 different electricity substations simultaneously using a small arms fire. Now, this was followed on the 25th of December by a similar attempt against substations in Washington, in Pierce County near Tacoma, and that ultimately left about 14,000 people without power and was repaired more rapidly than the incident in North Carolina.
So if I can just interject there, I mean, is this on the radar of the security agencies in the US?
It is. So in January of 2022, so just over a year ago, the Department of Homeland Security issued a report in which it outlined credible threats that have been made by far-right extremist groups with their intention to carry out targeted attacks against electricity infrastructure in the US. Now, just a couple weeks prior to the incident in North Carolina, the DHS sent a private note to electricity utilities warning them of a possible imminent threat posed by such groups who are motivated by racially and ethnically supremacist ideologies. So, rather, the DHS was a bit ahead of the curve on that and was able to give forewarning, although was not able to head off the threat entirely, as we saw.
So, Sydney, these far right and even far left single issue extremist groups tend to promulgate their message on social media. We've seen that through our own research and collection. Has any of this hit the social media channels?
Well, actually, It was found on a Telegram channel recently, a 14-page document outlining how to carry out these exact low-level attacks against electricity substations using small arms fire. And the interesting thing is that this document was compiled by a far-right group, but in fact the Telegram channel on which it was found belonged to an ultra-left Marxist extremist group, basically. So you might even see a dynamic in which different groups motivated by different ideologies are all trying to implement the similar technique to create unrest.
I mean, it's absolutely intriguing. The burning question is why? What's the motivation? But I think, you know, our listeners and viewers will be asking more so, what next? Do we see this continuing into 2023 or even escalating?
Indeed, it seems that this type of incident where people use small arms fire against electricity, grid infrastructure, and substations is an emerging tactic, technique, and procedure implemented by any extremist group that might be likely to pursue, you know, large-scale impact against the population in order to gain coverage and potentially undermine the credibility of government as well, particularly with, you know, trying to create large-scale power outages. The intent is understood to be that you undermine the credibility of government to respond in such a situation, and you might instigate further unrest against the government in that situation.
So as we go in, you know, through the electoral calendar in the US, do we then assess this might increase as we get closer to the election?
Yes, certainly. I would forecast that this type of low-level incident will increase in accordance with political tensions and political instability in the US as we move closer and closer to the 2024 presidential election cycle. And additionally, for private companies, the impact is a bit more tangible. So the North American Electricity Grid Reliability Corporation is on deadline to compile a report within 120 days, which is likely to call for greater grid hardening and physical security measures. So it's likely that also companies will become liable and more responsible for ensuring that those physical security requirements are in place, and therefore will have a subsequent, you know, policy and reputational risk.
So physical threats, physical risks, but also a regulatory burden for those companies involved. Really interesting topic, and I'm looking forward to the ongoing coverage from your desk. But for now, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Gareth.
And finally, we are joined by Zsofia Wolford to discuss rising tensions in Kosovo. Zsofia, welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Really great, and it's wonderful for you to join us on what is a really important issue. So, your desk has been covering this for quite a while now. Yes. We've seen some recent incidents, I know, but we have been, you know, pushing out documents and reports to clients for a good few months. For our viewers and listeners, I'm wondering if you could just put us in the picture as to the context of what we've been seeing over the last few months.
Sure. So I'll start from a bit earlier, because I'm sure many of our listeners might not be completely familiar with the background of Kosovo. So Kosovo became independent from Serbia in 2008. The majority of the international community recognizes Kosovo's independence, but Serbia continues to refuse to recognize their independence. Kosovo remains ethnically and religiously divided, which leads to flare-ups every now and then. So the current tensions that we are seeing now have started already in August last year, but in recent years we have seen many instances of ethno-religious tensions in Kosovo and tensions between Kosovo and Serbia.
Okay, so that's really great context, thank you. So potentially nothing that new, but can you just bring us up to speed with what we've been seeing recently?
Yes, so during the summer of last year, Kosovo's Prime Minister Kurti started to push for the re-registration of Serbian license plates in Kosovo, and that created considerable tensions between ethnic Serbs and ethnic Albanians in the country. Basically, Prime Minister Kurti wanted to ban Serbian license plates that have been issued by Serbia before 2008. But many ethnic Serbs perceive that as an act against the ethnic minority of the country. After Prime Minister Kurti started pushing for the re-registration of the license plates, a dialogue led by the EU started between Serbia and Kosovo. And in the end, in November, the two countries have agreed that Serbia will stop issuing license plates for Kosovo cities. Kosovo said that they will not ban the license plates that have been issued by Serbia in the past. So in the end, an agreement has been reached, but by that time we have seen considerable ethnic tensions in northern Kosovo.
So in December, I remember your desk actually pushed out a report. It was actually a daily entry in our World Risk Register, which detailed the arrest of a Serbian policeman and the resulting protests. Can you tell our listeners and viewers a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so as I said, an agreement has been reached in late November between Serbia and Kosovo, but that didn't put an end to the tensions because before the agreement was signed between the two countries, many ethnic Serb officials have resigned from their positions in Kosovo. And because of that, Kosovo scheduled elections for mid-December last year. But that sparked again a new wave of demonstrations by the ethnic Serb minority in the country, particularly in the northern part of the country. Those demonstrations have continued throughout December. And I think it was later in December when we have seen reports that a former Serbian police officer was arrested by Kosovo police units. So after the arrest of the ethnic Serb police officer, we have seen other members of the ethnic Serb community raising road blockades and barricades in northern Kosovo, and the tensions that we are seeing now have sometimes resulted in violence between ethnic Serbs and ethnic Albanians, especially between the minority and the police forces, which now constitute mostly of ethnic Albanians after the mass resignation of ethnic Serbs from public offices.
So we're seeing ongoing tensions then. It looks like the flare-ups aren't going to stop. Now, like many of our listeners and viewers, I'm old enough to remember the wars of the late 90s. Is that where we're heading? Are we heading for something more substantial in terms of an armed conflict? Or is this just kind of usual and what we forecast?
So already in 2021 we have seen tensions increasing between ethnic Serbs and ethnic Albanians because of the controversial issue of the re-registration of car licenses. In 2021 we have seen roads being blocked between Serbia and Kosovo. We have seen arson attacks again on car registration offices. And in response to these events, Serbia put its military on high readiness. And in 2021, Serbia actually moved some military assets to its borders with Kosovo. This year, we have not seen any military assets being moved to the borders with Kosovo, but Serbia did put its military on high alert at the end of December last year after the Serbian police officer the ethnic Serb police officer was arrested by Kosovo police forces.
Okay, so I'm going to try and pin you down here now, Zsofia, before we leave for today. Conflict, armed conflict or potentially war in 2023 between Kosovo and Serbia. What do you think?
I think there is reason to be optimistic that although we are seeing these tensions, we have been seeing these tensions over the past 6 months. We have seen positive developments regarding the relationship between Serbia and Kosovo. So I think military confrontation between the two countries will remain quite unlikely, especially considering the presence of NATO-led peacekeeping forces in Kosovo. But also we have seen increased efforts by the European Union and also by the United States to mediate between the two countries in order to integrate them faster into the European Union and also to tackle Russian influence in the region. So last year we have seen a deal between Serbia and Kosovo for the free movement of their citizens, but also Pristina have submitted their application for EU membership last year. So I think there is now a window of opportunity for these two countries to normalize their relationships, especially considering that it is now a priority for the European Union to ensure that there are no new conflicts in its neighborhood.
So reasons for optimism.
Yes.
I always like to end on an optimistic note, and thank you so much, Zsofia, for joining us. And that's it for this week. Big thank you to Anastasia, Sydney, and Zsofia, and of course thanks to you for joining us. Please join us again in our next episode, and remember to like and subscribe however you're viewing or listening to this episode.